6.8%. That was today's year-over-year headline CPI print. That is the worst since 1982, I think. 7.1, or maybe it was since 1990, somewhere around there. It was about 30, maybe 30 years, over 30 years. Longer than I've been alive, certainly. It's a no good, very bad CPI print. The month over month, if you thought that was bad, month over month was even worse. It shows no sign of slowing. It was 0.8% in 1 month, or about 9.6% annualized. So things are not going well. And you know, there have been some comparisons to 1970s and stagflation. And that whole debacle back then when we had high inflation. That was the last period of real high inflation in the United States. It was 1970s going into the early days of the Reagan administration when Paul Volcker heroically raised interest rates to 20%. And something that most people don't know is that inflation was actually calculated differently back then. It was a much more honest reading of inflation. And after all of the bad headlines that more accurate and honest inflation, CPI, Consumer Price Index methodology, it did not help the politicians because people had a better understanding of how bad inflation really was. They could see the number themselves on TV. And so after 1980, after the inflation was swept was done away with, and came to an end, at least that real high inflation, they decided to change the methodology so that if we ever went into a period like that again of the 1970s, it would be much more hidden in the statistics and you wouldn't be able to see it as well because they rigged the CPI to understate inflation. Housing prices, for example, which I talk about so much on this channel, being ridiculous, in how fast they've gone up and how historically absurd they are when you look at a 100-year chart. Housing prices used to be included in the Consumer Price Index, believe it or not. Housing prices used to affect inflation because, well, common sense would tell you, hey, everybody has to have a house or an apartment or something. So people need housing to live. Shelter is one of the most basic needs up there with food. You would think, oh, inflation, it should include housing and food and all these other things that people need. But these days, that's not the case. They stuff the CPI full of things that people really don't need and, prices that are less volatile. And so as a result, they're able to hold the CPI much lower than it otherwise would be. So you have to go to a website, shadowstats.com, to get sort of the conversion of the modern day inflation numbers back into the old methodology so that we can actually directly compare the numbers of today with the numbers of yesteryear. And what ShadowStats found is that using the pre-1980 methodology, the CPI would not be 6.8% today. It would be 14.9%. So just as bad as it was, at the peak back in 1980, which I believe ShadowStats show that it was, it peaked at 14.7%. And so that does not bode well for us. We don't want to be in that kind of a period. And is it a guarantee that things are going to be like that? No. As I've said in the past, the bond market and Eurodollar's futures curve, which other people who are smarter than me talk about, they would seem to be indicating the opposite. And so this is a very strange time because, we've got kind of the battle of the century going on right now. You've got the CPI numbers, or the ShadowStats CPI, to be more specific, versus the 10-year Treasury yield, just as a general proxy for the bond market and funding markets. And so I don't know if this is going to continue on for a decade like it did in the 1970s. I surely hope that that's not the case. But what I do know is that prices are not going to go back down. It's not the way that inflation works. We never have deflation in this country. Our authorities do not allow it. It never happens. Things always get more expensive. Cost of living always goes up. And you as an individual person In order to maintain the same standard of living throughout your entire life, you have to make more and more money just to stay place. It's a treadmill that keeps speeding up faster and faster. And if you aren't able to whip yourself into shape and run faster and faster as time goes on, you're going to fall behind. And sometimes that treadmill, it speeds up, it accelerates quicker than at other times. It's always accelerating, but it's a matter of how fast is it accelerating. And right now, that treadmill is accelerating very quickly. You have to be making a lot more money now than you did 2 years ago in order to have the same standard of living. And if you still make the same amount of money that you did 2 years ago, you can't just wait this out. This is not transitory in the sense that, oh, well, if you just wait 3 years, your standard of living will go back up. The prices of the things you buy will go down. The prices of used cars and new cars will go down. That's what they want you to believe. But that's false. The prices of housing will go down. Well, unless there is a systemic financial collapse, which I hope there is, that seems to be what the funding markets are signaling. So I'd much rather believe the funding markets than the CPI. Unless that happens, you are going to be poorer and poorer and poorer. And even if we do have a financial collapse, asset prices will fall. Consumer prices will not. So things like food, price of food's not going down. Price of gas might. That depends. Gas prices, they go up and down. But new cars, computers, TVs, these things are probably going to stay high. Just any widget in general. Any product which has to be manufactured and packaged and shipped to a store or something that you find on Amazon. Commodities, the price of those can go up, they can go down. But finished goods, they tend to be pretty darn sticky. Once manufacturers and distributors and retailers have already ripped the Band-Aid of a price increase off, and they've been able to increase the price of their goods, they don't really want to lower them again. There's not a lot of incentive to, because it's really hard to raise your prices. It's really easy to cut them, but if you've already raised the prices and you're doing okay and people are still buying the product, even if it costs you less to produce it, it's gonna, this is one of the few things that Keynes talked about that there was a grain of truth to what he was saying, although people way overemphasize it. But prices of goods tend to be sticky, and that's because when things are volatile like this, people don't know necessarily if prices are going to be able to go down in the long term. We're not going to have long-term deflation. In all these other prices of inputs that go into these goods. And so the producers are going to want to keep prices high because they don't want to have to raise prices again later, because that's the difficult part. Really easy to cut prices, really hard to raise prices. So unless they're 100% confident the prices are going to remain low for the foreseeable future, if the prices of some things go back down, the products which are derived from those inputs are going to remain high. So the price of gas, that might actually be transitory. Price of housing, I hope that's transitory. It's been transitory for 12 years, but hopefully it goes back down to where it was before. 12 years probably the wrong price. At about 9 or 10 years. Housing prices have gone straight up for a decade. I remember when I was young, around the bottom of the market, the end of Obama's first term, housing was affordable. It was attainable. It was something that, to me, I was looking at the prices of houses back then, and I thought to myself, hey, I'll be able to afford a home someday. I knew people who were my age that I am now, who were buying houses back then, and who didn't make a lot of money. But, they hadn't gotten themselves burned. They weren't in a ton of debt when the 2008 crash happened. And so when the prices of things fell, they were able to go and, buy a house to live in. But that's gone now. We've had, a 10-year housing bubble. And we've got the price of everything else going straight up too. But leaving the past behind us and looking forward, there are those who are still naive enough to think that Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, will simply change policy, as they say at the Fed, to correct for this higher inflation by trying to, tighten the money supply, raise interest rates, end QE. But as I've said, that's not the case. Powell will not do that. I've gone over it many times. I don't need to go over it again today. But Zero Hedge may have discovered how Powell will get out of raising interest rates, because he's backed himself into a corner. As I said, when he said that it's time to retire the term transitory in relation to inflation, that was backing himself into a corner. Basically, acting like, he's going to raise rates, which I know he won't do. So how does he get out of that? Well, Zero Hedge found a little, it's hard to even call it a paragraph, but I guess that's what you'd call it, a little small heading on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website talking about how they're going to change the way that this consumer price index is weighted in 2022, which is a nice way of saying they're going to cook the books. They're going to change the way that CPI is calculated, again, so that moving forward after December of 2021, going into 2022, all of a sudden it'll look like, oh, inflation, CPI is dropping, it's going down. And in reality, it will be because they reweighted it to rig the CPI to seem lower than it is, just like they did after the 70s, and just like they always do. When they don't want the CPI, they wouldn't publish the CPI if it makes them look bad. That's not, the government doesn't want to do that. You don't want to rely on anyone to self-report their own faults. You want to have independent entities to watch for those sorts of things. But here in America, we don't. The federal government are the ones who keep track of inflation officially. So if the inflation numbers are making the federal government look bad, the federal government's going to have to rig them to make themselves look good. There's lies, there's damned lies, and then there's statistics, and then there's government statistics. Okay? It's a 4-tier chart there. And government statistics are by far the worst. So I think I'll leave it off there for today. I'll probably continue to develop this topic over the weekend. I have more thoughts on this, but I think I'll cut it off here for today.